The last thing I expected to see at my nephew's wedding was my ex-wife slipping untouched slices of prime rib into plastic containers. I laughed, not just to myself, out loud. Linda, I called across the serving station, making sure a few nearby guests could hear me. Taking leftovers home for your new husband. A couple of people chuckled. She stopped for a second, looked up at me, and held my eyes. There wasn't any anger in her face. No embarrassment. Just a quiet sadness I didn't understand. No, Michael, she said softly. Not for my husband. Then she snapped the lid onto another container, thanked the catering manager for letting her save the untouched food, and walked away. 15 minutes later, I was following her old Toyota Corolla through the rain, wondering why those 4 simple words had left me feeling like the smallest man in Ohio. My name is Michael Lawson. I'm 59 years old, retired, and until that night I thought I had my life figured out. Funny how one evening can prove you've been lying to yourself for years. I live alone in Dublin, Ohio, about 20 minutes northwest of downtown Columbus. The house is bigger than I need. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a 3-car garage. Back when Linda and I bought it, we imagined grandchildren running through the backyard someday. Instead, it became the kind of house where every sound echoes. Most mornings I wake up around 6 because my body still thinks I have somewhere to be. I brew coffee, read part of the newspaper, and watch the local morning news while eating toast. The television stays on even after I'm done watching. Not because I'm interested, because silence has a way of reminding me how empty the place really is. My daughter Emily calls once every few weeks. My son Ryan usually texts on birthdays and holidays. They're polite, busy. Their own families come first now. I tell people that's how life works. Sometimes I even convince myself. 6 years earlier, I divorced Linda after 28 years of marriage. At the time, I blamed her for almost everything. She gave too much. Trusted too easily, spent weekends volunteering instead of relaxing. She'd come home excited because she'd helped some struggling family pay a utility bill while I'd be sitting at the kitchen table wondering why we couldn't just save that money for ourselves. We've worked hard for this, I'd tell her. So have they? She'd answer. They've just had harder luck. Looking back, I realized we weren't arguing about money. We were arguing about what kind of people we wanted to become. I didn't see that then. Around that same time, I started spending more evenings at work. Or at least that's what I told Linda. There was a younger woman in the office, smart, funny. She laughed at my stories and made me feel important again. The affair lasted less than a year. The damage lasted forever. When Linda found out, she didn't scream, didn't throw dishes, didn't hire some expensive divorce attorney looking to destroy me. She simply sat across from me at our dining room table and asked one question. Is this really the life you want? I said yes. I still remember how quietly she nodded. Then I hope you find what you're looking for. That was it. No scene. No revenge. She signed the papers. She accepted a fair settlement. She wished me well. At the time I thought I'd won. Turns out some victories don't feel much like winning once the cheering stops. The relationship with the younger woman ended before our first anniversary together. She wanted excitement. I wanted stability. Neither of us got what we expected. Eventually she moved to Arizona with someone closer to her own age. I stayed behind with my empty house. The wedding invitation had come from my sister months earlier. Jason, her oldest grandson, was getting married at a beautiful country club outside Columbus. It was one of those warm June evenings where everyone lingered outside after dinner, talking under strings of lights while a jazz trio played old standards near the patio. Families posed for pictures. Kids chased each other across the lawn. The smell of grilled steak drifted through the open ballroom doors. It should have been a happy night. I arrived alone. Nobody mentioned it, but I noticed. Older relatives gave me sympathetic smiles. Younger cousins asked whether I was seeing anyone. I laughed it off. Too old to start over. That usually ended the conversation. Dinner was excellent. Prime rib, roasted vegetables, garlic mashed potatoes. The catering staff moved quietly around the room, clearing tables. That's when I saw her. At first I wasn't completely sure. Her hair was tied back beneath a black cap. She wore a white shirt, black apron, and comfortable shoes, instead of the dresses she used to wear to family weddings. She looked thinner, older, but there was no mistaking Linda. I watched from across the room. She wasn't serving drinks. She was carefully collecting untouched food from trays that had never reached guests. The catering manager handed her clean containers. She thanked him. Everything was neat, organized, intentional. Then I made the joke, the one I've replayed 1,000 times since. People laughed. She didn't. After she answered me with those 4 quiet words, I expected her to leave quickly. Instead, she finished every task with the same calm patience she'd always had. She wiped down tables, stacked chairs, helped another employee carry supplies. She acted as though my comment had never happened. Somehow, that bothered me more than if she'd slapped me. By the time I reached the parking lot, rain had started falling. I saw Linda loading the containers into the trunk of an old silver Toyota Corolla. The same woman who had once lived in a comfortable suburban home was driving a 15-year-old car with rust around the rear wheel well. Something didn't fit. If she'd remarried, why was she working weekend catering jobs? Why save leftover food? Where was this mysterious husband I joked about? I climbed into my SUV. The engine started with a quiet hum. For a moment, I told myself to go home. This wasn't my business anymore. Then Linda pulled out of the lot. Without thinking much harder, I followed. Not closely, just enough to keep her taillights in sight through the rain. Twice I almost turned around. What was I doing? Following your ex-wife at nearly 60 years old wasn't curiosity. It bordered on shame. At one red light, she glanced into her rearview mirror. For a second, I wondered if she'd recognize my SUV. She slowed slightly after making a turn. I eased back another 100 yards. The last thing I wanted was to frighten her. Eventually, she left the nicer neighborhoods behind. The streets grew darker. Older brick buildings replaced shopping centers. She pulled into the parking lot of an aging Methodist church near the west side of Columbus. Most of the windows were dark. Only the upstairs lights were on. Linda carried the containers inside. I parked across the street beneath a maple tree and watched. Less than a minute later, the front door burst open. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, ran down the hallway so fast that another woman had to call after him. "Slow down, Leo." He threw his arms around Linda's waist. Even through the rain and the closed windows, I could see the smile on his face. She knelt beside him and opened one of the containers. The boy's eyes grew wide. Behind him, more children appeared. Some laughed. Some clapped. One little girl hugged Linda from behind. I sat frozen behind my steering wheel. The windshield wipers swept back and forth, back and forth. I suddenly realized those containers had never been leftovers to her. They had been dinner for children waiting up long past bedtime. And for the first time in 6 years, I wasn't sure I had ever really known the woman I married. I slept maybe 3 hours that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that little boy throwing his arms around Linda. Then I heard my own voice again. "Taking that home for your new husband." It sounded uglier now than it had the night before. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I had already talked myself out of going back to that church twice. "It's none of your business," I muttered while pouring coffee. I drank half the mug, dumped the rest in the sink, grabbed my truck keys, and drove to Kroger instead. I filled a shopping cart with canned soup, pasta, peanut butter, cereal, diapers, paper towels, and bottled water. When the cashier asked whether I was stocking up for a storm, I smiled awkwardly. "No," I said, "just making a donation." Even as I said the words, I wasn't sure whether I was trying to help someone else or ease my own conscience. The church sat exactly where I'd left it the night before. The old brick building looked even older in daylight. The sign out front read, "Grace Community Methodist Church. All are welcome." Beneath it, someone had taped a handwritten notice. "Free community dinner. Every Tuesday and Saturday. No questions asked." There were flower beds near the entrance, but they hadn't been professionally landscaped. They were cared for by volunteers. I could tell from the uneven rows and the homemade wooden borders. As I carried the grocery bags toward the side entrance, a woman in her 60s opened the door before I reached it. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a faded Ohio State sweatshirt. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I brought a few things." She looked at the bags. Then she looked at me. "You here to volunteer?" She paused. Or just curious. There wasn't any accusation in her voice. Just experience. People like her had probably learned to recognize the difference. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. To my surprise, she smiled. "That's one of the more honest answers I've heard." She introduced herself as Carol and carried one of the bags inside. I followed. The church basement smelled like coffee, laundry detergent, and fresh bread. Nothing matched. The folding chairs came in 3 different colors. The tables had scratches and chipped corners. An old piano leaned against one wall with several keys missing, but the room felt alive. 2 teenagers were wiping tables while arguing about baseball. A retired Army veteran in a wheelchair teased a little girl for beating him at checkers. Someone in the kitchen laughed loud enough for the whole basement to hear. It wasn't polished. It was real. Carol pointed toward a storage room. "Just stack everything in there." As I set the groceries down, I heard a familiar voice. "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins." Linda. She walked through the hallway carrying a clipboard and smiled at an elderly woman struggling with a walker. "You made it?" "I almost stayed home," the woman admitted. Linda laughed. "If you stayed home, who would beat Frank at bingo?" The old woman smiled. "I suppose I should protect his reputation." Little moments. Nothing dramatic. just kindness that seemed completely natural. Linda noticed me a few minutes later. Her smile disappeared. Not because she looked angry, because she looked surprised. Michael, I brought some groceries. I can see that. Neither of us knew what to say next. Finally, she nodded toward the storage room. Thank you. That was it. No questions. No lecture about following her. No mention of the wedding. She simply walked back toward the kitchen. It somehow made me feel even worse. Carol eventually sat beside me with 2 paper cups of coffee. You know, Linda, we were married. Carol nearly dropped her cup. You were Michael. I blinked. You know my name. She smiled carefully. I know a little. That sentence made my stomach tighten. What exactly do you know? She stirred her coffee before answering. Only what matters. I waited. She always said you were a good provider. I laughed once. That's generous. Carol ignored the interruption. She said you worked hard. I did. She also said pride has a funny way of making decent people do foolish things. I looked down at my coffee. That sounded exactly like something Linda would say. Never cruel. Always leaving room for someone to become better. Over the next hour, I watched Linda move from one person to another without ever seeming rushed. She helped unpack donations, checked medication schedules for 2 elderly guests, knelt beside a little boy helping him finish a math worksheet. That boy was Leo, the same child I'd seen hugging her the night before. His hair was growing back in uneven patches. His face still looked pale. He couldn't have been more than 7. When he solved a multiplication problem, Linda clapped softly. There you go. He grinned. I only needed one hint. You needed confidence, she corrected. That's different. I finally asked Carol the question that had been bothering me. Does Linda work here? Carol laughed. I wish we could afford her. So she's a volunteer. 5 years now. Every day. Most days. What about the catering job? Carol leaned back. Weekend work. Why? We don't pay salaries. She said it as though it were obvious. Linda works Friday nights and weekends with a catering company. Every dollar goes right back in here. I frowned. What do you mean? Medicine. School supplies. Utility bills. Gas cards. Winter coats. Sometimes rent. Carol looked around the room. You see all this? I nodded. None of it happens by accident. As lunchtime approached, more families arrived. A young mother apologized because her toddler spilled apple juice. Linda simply handed her another cup. No harm done. An older man quietly admitted he couldn't afford his blood pressure medication until next week. Linda slipped an envelope into his shirt pocket. He started to refuse. She smiled. Just let me win this argument. The man laughed. You always do. Watching her felt strangely familiar. Then I realized why. She had always been exactly like this. Even when we were married, I'd simply spent years calling it weakness. Around 2 o'clock, I wandered outside for fresh air. Behind the church, 2 volunteers were unloading boxes from a pickup truck. They hadn't noticed me. One of them said, Leo finally gained 3 pounds. The other smiled. Linda nearly cried when the doctor told her. Hard to believe she fought 18 months just to become his legal guardian. County paperwork was a nightmare. Worth it. After what happened to his parents, the second volunteer nodded. He would have ended up bouncing through foster homes. Instead, he got her. I stood perfectly still. Legal guardian. Not remarried. Not raising a grandson. Not hiding some new husband. She had stepped into the life of a child who had no one left. Before I could process that, another black SUV rolled into the parking lot. A well-dressed man stepped out wearing khakis and a navy blazer. Volunteers greeted him with handshakes. One even thanked him. Mr. Vance, we're glad you could stop by. He smiled like a man used to being admired. Near the entrance stood a banner I hadn't noticed earlier. Community dinner, generously supported by the Greg Vance Foundation. The name hit me like a punch. Greg Vance, my former business partner. The man I hadn't spoken to in years. He waved at volunteers as though he owned the place. Then I looked toward Linda. The moment she saw him, something changed. Her shoulders stiffened. Without saying a word, she handed her clipboard to Carol. She quietly led Leo through a side hallway. Away from Greg. Away from the front entrance. She wasn't afraid. She was avoiding him. And suddenly I realized something far more troubling than my own guilt. The 2 people I never expected to see in the same place already knew each other. I sat in my truck for nearly 20 minutes after Greg Vance drove away from the church. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, but I barely noticed. Greg. Out of all the people in Columbus, why was he connected to Linda? The last time I'd seen him had been 7 years earlier, just before I accepted an early retirement package from the construction supply company we'd helped build together. At least that's what I had always believed. Back then, I blamed the company for my disappointing retirement. I blamed the economy. I blamed bad timing. Eventually, I blamed age. It never crossed my mind to blame Greg. That afternoon, for the first time in years, I pulled out my phone and searched for his name. The first result made my stomach tighten. Greg Vance announces campaign for Columbus City Council. The article praised his business success, his charitable foundation, and his commitment to helping working families. There was even a photograph of him handing a ceremonial check to a local nonprofit. He looked exactly the same. Confident, well-groomed, perfect smile. The kind of man people trusted before they even knew him. I stared at the screen. Then another memory surfaced. Linda had never trusted him. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. David Collins. He and I had started at the company in the same year. We'd attended each other's weddings, played golf every spring. Our friendship faded after my divorce, mostly because I stopped returning his calls. He answered on the fourth ring. Michael, yeah. A short silence followed. I figured I'd hear from you eventually. You did. I heard you were asking about Greg. That caught me off guard. Word travels. It always does. He sighed. You want to talk? I do. Then come to my house. David lived in Westerville now, smaller place than the one he'd owned years ago. His wife Nancy greeted me kindly as if no time had passed. She set out coffee and homemade banana bread before leaving us alone on the back patio. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Grandchildren, blood pressure, the Cleveland Browns disappointing everyone once again. Neither of us wanted to be the first to open the old wounds. Finally, David leaned back in his chair. So, you saw Linda? I nodded. At Jason's wedding. He looked at me carefully. How'd that go? I embarrassed myself. I'm sorry to hear that. No, I shook my head. I'm sorry I did it. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee. That's a different sentence. I told him everything. The wedding, the church, Leo, Greg showing up. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands together. Michael, there's something you should have known years ago. I laughed bitterly. That list is getting pretty long. This one's important. Do you remember when Linda came to your office one Friday afternoon? I frowned. Not really. She asked to speak with you privately. A blurry memory drifted back. Linda standing outside my office, holding a folder, looking nervous. I remember telling her I was busy. David nodded. You weren't. You were in Greg's office. The words landed harder than I expected. What was in the folder? Copies of invoices. I stared at him. What invoices? Fake ones. David stood and walked inside the house. A minute later, he returned carrying an old leather binder. He opened it carefully. You remember these subcontractor payments? I looked down. Some names seemed familiar. Others didn't. Greg created several shell vendors. He billed the company for work that never happened. I frowned. Why didn't accounting catch it? They almost did. He looked directly at me. Linda caught it first. For several seconds, I couldn't say anything. David continued quietly. She noticed numbers that didn't make sense. How? She was organizing your tax paperwork. I remembered that. Linda had always handled our household files. Receipts, insurance, tax documents, everything. She compared invoices with bank statements. David tapped one page. The totals didn't match. My heartbeat quickened. She tried to warn me. 3 times. Memory has a strange way of returning. Not all at once. Little pieces. Like photographs scattered across a floor. I suddenly remembered Linda standing in our kitchen, holding papers. Michael, I think Greg's stealing. I remembered laughing. Not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. Greg, he's my partner. You don't understand the business. She didn't argue. She simply handed me the papers. I never looked at them. I tossed them onto the counter. David broke the silence. The next Monday, Greg came into my office. He told everyone Linda was becoming paranoid. I looked up. What? He said the stress from your marriage was affecting her judgment. My chest tightened. He even joked that she'd probably accuse him of stealing the office furniture next. I closed my eyes. I remembered laughing. Again. God, I'd laughed. There was more, David said. You don't have to keep going. I think I do. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to tell me the truth. You remember the company Christmas party? Another memory. Hotel ballroom. Open bar. Live music. Linda arriving late after volunteering at a food drive. Greg walking over with a drink in his hand. He smiled politely. Then he looked at me. Your wife's still chasing conspiracy theories. People nearby laughed. I laughed too. I put my arm around Greg's shoulder. Don't worry. I'll keep her away from the accounting department. Even now I could hear my own voice. Smug. dismissive. Linda had been standing only a few feet away. I remembered seeing the hurt in her eyes. At the time, I thought she was overreacting. Now I realized something far worse. That was probably the exact moment she understood she'd already lost her husband. David quietly closed the binder. She stopped trying after that. I swallowed hard. So she left because she knew you trusted Greg more than her. Not because of the affair. The affair had finished what pride had already started. I drove home feeling physically sick. Every mile brought another forgotten memory. Linda asking questions. Greg answering them for me believing him. By the time I reached my driveway, I could barely look at myself in the rearview mirror. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Carol from the church. Her voice sounded worried. "Michael, I'm sorry to bother you." "What's wrong?" She hesitated. "Linda won't ask for help, but I think someone should." My pulse quickened. "What happened?" She lowered her voice. "A real estate company made another offer on the church." I thought the church wasn't for sale. "It isn't." "Then why worry?" "Because the company keeps buying property all around us." I frowned. "Who's behind it?" Another pause. "We're not completely sure, but one name keeps appearing. Greg Vance." I stood frozen in my kitchen. Carol continued. "If he gets this building, our shelter closes, our food pantry closes, and Leo," her voice cracked, "Leo won't have a place to live." I slowly lowered the phone. For years I'd believed exposing Greg might help clear my conscience. Now it wasn't about me anymore. If I walked away again, I wouldn't just lose Linda a second time. I'd be abandoning every person she had spent years protecting. I wish I could tell you I marched into Greg Vance's office the next morning, uncovered a smoking gun, and watched everything fall neatly into place. Life doesn't work that way, especially not when you're trying to expose a man who spent years making powerful friends. The first thing I did was call an attorney I'd used during my retirement. He listened patiently while I explained what David had told me. When I finished, he sighed. "Michael, do you have proof?" "Not yet." "Then what you have is a story. And stories don't hold up in court." He wasn't being dismissive. He was telling me the truth. Without documents, witnesses, or financial records, Greg was simply a respected businessman running for public office. I was a retired salesman with a failed marriage and plenty of regrets. If I accused Greg publicly without evidence, I'd only destroy what little credibility I had left. So I started where I should have started years earlier. I looked for facts. The company I'd worked for had changed ownership after I retired. Most of the old accounting records had been digitized, and access required legal authorization. I didn't have it. I spent 3 days calling former coworkers. Some never answered. Others answered but ended the conversation as soon as I mentioned Greg. One woman whispered, "Please don't call me again." Before hanging up, she added, "He's got friends everywhere." That sentence stayed with me. David helped where he could. We met twice a week at a diner in Westerville called Schneider's. The coffee was terrible. The pie was excellent. We spread old notes across our table like two detectives who had waited far too long to solve a case. One morning, David slid a yellow legal pad toward me. "I found another name." "Who?" "Janet Miller. The old payroll supervisor. I thought she moved to Florida." "She did. But she's back." I called her that afternoon. She agreed to meet. Janet lived in a modest ranch house outside Grove City. She looked older than I remembered, but so did I. After we sat down, I asked about Greg. She immediately shook her head. "I'm retired. I don't want trouble." "I'm not asking you to testify." "Then what are you asking?" "The truth." She studied me for several seconds. "You should have listened to Linda." There it was again. Everyone seemed to know what I'd refused to see. Janet stood and disappeared into another room. When she returned, she carried a small cardboard box. I kept these. Inside were old payroll summaries, vendor payment logs, and handwritten notes. I couldn't prove anything, but I knew something wasn't right. I flipped through the papers. Some of the vendor names matched the invoices David had shown me. Others were completely unfamiliar. "This isn't enough," I said. "Nope, it isn't. But it tells you where to keep looking." For the next 2 weeks, my routine changed completely. Instead of spending mornings watching television, I drove across Columbus chasing loose ends. A retired bookkeeper remembered a warehouse lease. An old truck driver remembered deliveries that never happened. A former office assistant remembered Greg insisting that certain invoices bypassed normal approval procedures. None of it proved fraud. But together, the stories began pointing in the same direction. I also spent every Saturday at Grace Community Church. Not because I wanted Linda to notice. Honestly, she barely did. She thanked me when I fixed broken shelves in the pantry. She smiled when I repaired a leaking faucet in the kitchen. That was all. There were no long conversations. No emotional breakthroughs. Trust, I was learning, grows much slower than guilt. One afternoon, Leo wandered into the maintenance room while I was repairing an old bicycle. He watched quietly for a minute before asking, "Did you fix bikes when you were little?" I laughed. "When I was your age, I tried." "Were you good?" "No." "My dad was." The room fell silent. I remembered Carol telling me Leo's parents had died in a car accident. "I'm sorry," I said. He shrugged the way children sometimes do when life has forced them to grow up too quickly. "Miss Linda says my dad would want me to keep smiling." I tightened the last bolt on the bicycle. "I think she's probably right." He grinned. "I think so too." Simple words, but they stayed with me. A week later, Carol found me replacing light bulbs in the fellowship hall. "We've got a problem." "What happened?" She handed me a letter. The church had received notice that another nearby property had been purchased. The buyer was a limited liability company none of us had ever heard of. David looked into it. The LLC traced back to another company, then another. Finally, one name appeared. Greg Vance. He wasn't buying the church directly. He was buying everything around it. Parking lots, vacant buildings, small parcels of land. Piece by piece, he was surrounding the property. If the church can't expand parking or meet new zoning requirements, David explained later that evening, developers can pressure them into selling. It was perfectly legal. It was also ruthless. Grace Community wasn't just a church. It housed emergency shelter beds, food storage, after-school tutoring, and temporary housing for children like Leo. If the church disappeared, so would everything built inside it. For the first time, exposing Greg wasn't about correcting the past. It was about protecting the future. Then came the break we'd been praying for. Janet called. "I found someone." "Who?" "Harold Simmons." I recognized the name immediately. Harold had been the company's senior accountant before retiring. If anyone knew the financial records inside and out, it was him. The only problem, Harold was 81 years old and living in assisted living after suffering a mild stroke. David and I visited him together. At first, he struggled to remember details. We almost left. Then Harold suddenly looked at me. "Michael." "Yes." "You still trust Greg?" The question hit harder than any accusation. "No, not anymore." Harold slowly smiled. "Good." He pointed toward an old metal filing cabinet beside his bed. "My daughter wanted me to throw everything away. I couldn't." Inside the bottom drawer sat a worn black ledger. Real paper. Handwritten entries. Cross-reference account numbers. Vendor payments. Bank transfers. Notes. Harold tapped one page with a trembling finger. "I kept this because computers can disappear." "But ink?" He smiled faintly. "Our ink lasts." David's accountant confirmed what we'd begun to suspect. The ledger connected shell vendors to real bank accounts. Money had been diverted over several years. Nearly $2 million. The documentation wasn't complete enough for an immediate arrest, but it was more than enough to justify an official investigation. The timing couldn't have been more important. Greg's final public town hall before Election Day was only 5 days away. David looked at me. "You know you have to be the one." "I don't know if I can." "You owe Linda." He shook his head. "No, you owe yourself." The auditorium at the Columbus Community Center was packed. Television cameras lined the back wall. Reporters shuffled between rows. Neighbors, veterans, church volunteers, business owners, hundreds of people had come to hear Greg speak. He walked confidently onto the stage. Dark blue suit, American flag pin on his lapel, the perfect smile I'd seen so many times before. He spent nearly 30 minutes talking about integrity, transparency, serving the community. The audience applauded. Then the moderator opened the floor for questions. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone around me could hear it. I stood. Greg recognized me immediately. His smile never changed. "Michael Lawson," he said warmly. "It's been a long time." "It has. I hope retirement's treating you well?" A few people chuckled. He was trying to make me look harmless. Just another retired old man asking a question. I almost sat back down. Then I remembered Linda quietly packing those containers. Leo waiting for dinner. The people filling the church basement every week. I took a slow breath. "Greg," I said clearly enough for the room to hear, "would you explain these vendor payments?" The room went silent. The silence after my question felt endless. Greg looked at the papers in my hands, then back at me. For just a second, the smile he'd worn all evening disappeared. Then it came right back. "Michael," he said with a small laugh, "I think retirement has given you too much free time." A few people in the audience laughed with him. I couldn't blame them. If I had been sitting in those chairs a year earlier, I probably would have laughed too. Greg spread his hands as if he were humoring an old friend. "These are accounting records from years ago. I have no idea what you're trying to prove." I didn't answer. Instead, I handed a copy of the ledger to the moderator, another to one of the reporters sitting near the front. Greg's expression tightened. He hadn't expected that. The moderator adjusted his glasses and looked down at the pages. "What exactly are these, Mr. Lawson?" Before I could answer, a familiar voice came from the aisle. "I can explain." Every head in the room turned. Harold Simmons slowly walked toward the front with the help of a cane. David was beside him. The room became so quiet I could hear the wheels of a television camera moving across the floor. Harold reached the microphone. "My name is Harold Simmons. I served as senior accountant at Midstate Construction Supply for 23 years. He rested both hands on his cane before continuing. "I kept those records because I believed one day someone honest would need them." Greg interrupted immediately. "Harold, with all due respect, your health?" "My memory," Harold smiled. "It isn't perfect." He tapped the ledger. "But my handwriting hasn't forgotten a thing." A few people in the audience chuckled. This time, Greg didn't. Harold carefully explained how fake vendor accounts had been created, how payments were split into smaller amounts to avoid attention, how signatures had been copied, how internal approvals mysteriously disappeared. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Facts have a way of speaking for themselves. The reporter beside the stage was already typing into her phone. Another stepped outside, probably calling the newsroom. Greg glanced toward the exit. For the first time in 20 years, I saw fear in his eyes. The debate ended early. Not because of me, because the questions from the audience completely changed. People stopped asking about taxes and road repairs. They wanted to know about shell companies, missing money, forgery. Greg refused to answer. His campaign manager hurried him through a side door. By the next morning, every local television station in Columbus was running the story. City council candidate faces questions over old business records. 3 days later, investigators from both state and federal agencies requested copies of Harold's ledger. David turned over everything we'd collected. Janet agreed to provide a statement. Several former employees, encouraged by the growing investigation, finally came forward. One after another, people who had stayed silent for years decided they were tired of carrying someone else's secrets. 2 weeks later, Greg suspended his campaign. Another month passed before he was formally indicted on multiple counts of financial fraud, tax evasion, and falsifying business records. Justice didn't happen overnight, but it happened. The church never held a celebration. That surprised me. I expected applause, maybe a victory dinner. Instead, the following Saturday looked exactly like every other Saturday. Breakfast at 8, tutoring at 10, community lunch at noon, children running through the hallway, volunteers washing dishes. Life simply continued. Linda never mentioned Greg. Not once. One afternoon, I finally asked Carol why. She smiled while stacking canned vegetables on a shelf. Because Greg was never the center of Linda's life. What was... Carol looked toward the fellowship hall. Those people. I followed her gaze. Leo was helping an elderly veteran carry folding chairs. A teenage girl was teaching 2 younger children how to play checkers. A single mother laughed as someone handed her a fresh loaf of bread. Carol was right. Greg had spent years trying to build a reputation. Linda had spent those same years quietly building a community. I kept volunteering. Not every day, but every Saturday, sometimes during the week if something needed fixing. Old habits helped. I repaired broken cabinets, replaced cracked ceiling tiles, installed new shelves in the pantry. Nobody treated me like a hero. I wasn't one. I was simply another volunteer trying to be useful. Trust came slowly. Exactly as it should. My relationship with my children changed slowly too. Emily didn't suddenly forgive me. Ryan didn't start calling every night. Real life isn't like that. But little things began to happen. Emily invited me to my granddaughter's soccer game. Ryan asked whether I wanted to help him replace a fence behind his house. We didn't talk much while we worked. Sometimes healing begins with silence instead of speeches. One Saturday in June, nearly a year after Jason's wedding, Leo found me tightening the chain on his bicycle. He stood beside me holding something behind his back. "Mr. Mike." "Yeah, buddy. I made this." He handed me a folded card. The front showed a crooked drawing of a bicycle, a toolbox, and 2 stick figures. Inside, written in oversized letters, were the words, "Thank you for fixing my bike. Happy Father's Day." I stared at the card for a long moment. "I think you gave this to the wrong person." He shook his head. "No, you always help." Before I could answer, he hugged me and ran back toward the basketball court. I walked outside and sat in my truck. Then, for the first time since my divorce, I cried without trying to stop myself. Not because I wished Leo were my son. Not because I thought one good deed erased years of selfishness. I cried because kindness still had room for me even after everything I'd done. That autumn, Linda and I finally sat down together. The maple trees behind the church had turned bright shades of orange and red. Children were playing basketball nearby. Leo made a shot and celebrated like he'd won the NBA championship. Linda laughed. I'd missed that laugh. I owe you an apology, I said. She looked at me quietly. I should have listened to you. I should have respected you. I blamed Greg for a long time. I shook my head. But Greg didn't make me ignore you. He didn't make me betray you. Those were my choices. Linda didn't interrupt. She simply listened. After a long silence, she said, I forgave you years ago. I know. No, she smiled gently. I don't think you do. If I hadn't forgiven you, I would have carried that anger into every child I tried to help. She looked toward the playground. I couldn't let that happen. I took a slow breath. Would you ever? I stopped. She waited. Would you ever consider starting over? Her answer came with kindness. No, Michael. Not harsh. Not hesitant. Simply honest. I don't hate you. I just spent too many years learning who I was after our marriage. She smiled. I'm finally at peace. I don't want to lose that. I nodded. The words hurt, but they also felt fair. Then she reached over and gently squeezed my hand. You finally became the man I always hoped you could be. She looked into my eyes. I just needed you 20 years earlier. Neither of us spoke after that. We didn't need to. Some truths arrived too late to change yesterday, but they're still early enough to change tomorrow. I still live in the same house in Dublin. It doesn't feel quite as empty anymore. Not because someone moved in, because I stopped filling the silence with regret. Some evenings I drive to the church just to help clean the kitchen after dinner. Sometimes Emily joins me with my granddaughter. Ryan has volunteered twice this year. Leo still beats me at basketball more often than I'd like to admit. Life isn't perfect. It never will be. But it's honest. And after everything that happened, honesty feels like the greatest gift I've ever been given. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: pride can keep us from recognizing the best people in our lives until they're gone. If someone came to your mind while listening to my story, maybe today's the day to call them, thank them, or simply tell them you love them. We never know how much time we have or how much healing a single conversation can begin.